final featured speaker is Jeannot of Gonzaga University. Tom, take it away.
Thank you, John. Hey, it's really great to be here. And I want you to know that I'm a Johnny-come-lately to Lonergan Scholarship, but it's a great way to go out, so I'm really happy. So this is like 60 pages. If I could read to page 20, that'd be great, and I'll quit at 17 if I have to.
I'll keep an eye out for you, okay?
Yeah. So it's called The Dialectic of Culture in Robert Doran's Theology and the Dialectics of History. Some friends and I have been spending our natural lifetime reading Father Doran's magisterial Theology and the Dialectics of History, the book that Father Crow called a real ball-buster. Doran admits that the book is too long, but it also leads Neil Omerod to call him a nuclear-powered theologian. The question that preoccupied him in the 1980s, when he spent a good decade writing it, was this: how are we to speak today about what Jesus proclaimed as the kingdom or reign of God in human society and history? The book came out in 1990. It consists in an effort to provide at least some of the basic categories that might be useful in our time to speak about the reality that Jesus proclaimed in his own Jewish context. It is structured around a vast and complicated development of a very simple schema of a scale of value that Lonergan presents in Method and Theology. The upshot is a massive development of Lonergan's theory of dialectic. A dialectic is a relation of linked but opposed principles. Doran distinguishes a dialectic of contraries from a dialectic of contradictories. Contraries, such as psyche and intentionality, intersubjective spontaneity and practicality, and cosmological and anthropological principles of culture, are complementary and subject to mediation and integration into higher viewpoints, whereas contradictory relations such as truth versus falsehood and good versus evil are arrayed as counterpositions to be reversed and positions to be affirmed. With the distinction between contraries and contradictories in hand, which is also represented by Aristotle's square of opposition, Doran develops the analogy of dialectic to demonstrate how these two dialectics operate by analogy in a dialectic of the subject, a dialectic of community, and a dialectic of culture. Reminiscing with Dorothy Cummings at Regis College in 2006, he says that he took the dialectics of the subject and community from chapter 7 of Insight, but the dialectic of culture is his original contribution. Finally, for each dialectic of subject, community, culture, there is an integral dialectic and a homeostatic equilibrium, and there are distortions which, by virtue of their one-sidedness, cause derailments and breakdowns, collapses into immanence, and ungrounded flights of an overreaching transcendence. With respect to finality, then, there is the prospect of a flatline finality, a complete decline into general bias, and a post-historic humanity, since, our favorite line, a civilization in decline digs its own grave with relentless consistency. Or else there is the prospect of a vertical finality, by way of the divinely initiated solution from above to the problem of evil, in tandem with the creativity from below of human development and self-transcendence, however plotting, which takes the labor, the patience, and the suffering of the negative on the way to a world cultural humanity and cosmopolis. In the interview with Cummings, Doran also tells us how he came around to Lonergan's thought in the first place, since he had never been Lonergan's student. As a Jesuit scholastic, he formally studied philosophy through licentiate and MA at St. Louis University, which was then a major center of neo-scholasticism. He tells Cummings that philosophy at St. Louis was dominated by the figure of Gilson, and took shape in the form of an existential Thomism centered on the real distinction between essence and existence, on the warrant of deante et essentia. The central notion in this way of interpreting St. Thomas is the act of existence. This interpretation, not merely Thomistic but Thomist, Doran takes to be the metaphysics of Aquinas himself, and he affirms it because in its existential character, it is neither conceptualist nor essentialist. However, when Doran was drafted to teach a year-long course on metaphysics to Jesuit scholastics at the Bellarmine School of Philosophy and Letters at St. Louis U, he declined to teach it in the Gilsonian way on account of its starting point in naive realism. His misgiving about the naive realism of his Toronto-trained professors finally brought him to read Insight cover to cover. He bought it for $5 in 1962, and then he tried to crack it 5 times before the summer of 1967, when he was preparing to teach his course. From the start, however, from Lonergan's preface and introduction, he realized that he had found what he had been looking for. It took him 3 months to finish it that summer. By chapter 7, he was hooked. What hooked him were Lonergan's presentations of the dialectic of community, the biases, and cosmopolis. Doran's professors teaching him the Missouri Valley School of Thomistic thought held on to naive or immediate or direct realism because they harbored a deep suspicion that Lonergan was in fact an idealist. Reckoning with the notion of interiority at the heart of Lonergan's thought, the pons asinorum of Lonergan's studies, Doran tells Cummings that their view was, once you go in, you'll never go out. Doran's initial encounter with Aquinas' thought, as taught by Gilsonians, contrasts with Lonergan's initial encounter with Aquinas at Hathrop, mediated by Suaresian professors. For Doran, the Gilsonian interpretation of St. Thomas runs aground on the shoals of naive realism. For Lonergan, the Suaresian interpretation of St. Thomas runs aground on the shoals of conceptualism and essentialism. Naive realism and conceptualism are the rock and the hard place. In Verbum, Lonergan employs the distinction whereby Thomist means of St. Thomas and Thomistic means of his school. Adopting this distinction, we can say that for Lonergan and Doran, Gilsonian and Suaresian readings are Thomistic, but not Thomist. To grasp the significance of this seemingly pedantic distinction, we can frame what is at issue in the standard and customary way by way of invoking a turn to the subject in classical modern European philosophy as it was emblematically taken by Descartes. Descartes proposed to abandon the ruins of late medieval scholasticism and build a new city de novo. This project entailed a reconsideration of first philosophy. Aristotle held that metaphysics was first philosophy. The Cartesian, Lockean, Kantian project placed epistemology first. Kant assigned it priority over what he called dialectic, namely the free spinning wheels that engender the illusions of classical and rationalist metaphysics. This familiar story, pivoting on the question whether the turn to the subject counts as philosophical progress or decline, will lead us right back to the main plot. When Lonergan went to Hathrop to study philosophy with Suaresian professors, thinking he was studying Aquinas, he was initially put off. But Doran continues the story in his interview with Cummings. Lonergan didn't really discover Thomas until 1936. The Suaresians who first exposed him to Aquinas from 1926 to 1929 were Thomistic rather than Thomist in both epistemology and metaphysics, inasmuch as conceptualism had seized the day. As Lonergan puts it in Verbum, conceptualism treats knowing as a metaphysical sausage machine, at one end slicing species off phantasm, and at the other popping out concepts. Lonergan could not be persuaded to this. As he raised himself up to the mind of Aquinas, he concluded that Aquinas was an intellectualist, not a conceptualist. In Verbum, he recognized that he was swimming upstream. his intellectualist interpretation of Thomist thought ran counter to the currently accepted conceptualist view. On the other side of the Atlantic, Doran's account of his own grasp of St. Thomas implies that the Gilsonians were Thomistic in epistemology, they were naive realists, while they were Thomists of St. Thomas in their metaphysics. Here's where Doran's mind in 1967 meets up with Lonergan's mind in 1936. The central point concerns the existential cast and character of Aquinas' metaphysics. In The Natural Desire to See God, Lonergan explains why his thought is intellectualist rather than conceptualist, dynamic rather than static, and existential rather than essentialist. But these are just the dimensions he discovers when he encounters Aquinas again at the Gregorian in 1936. Doran recounts the decisive issue to Cummings. I think this is amazing. Lonergan recognized that the real distinction is necessary to a theological presentation of the hypostatic union, the Word and the existence of the Word, the incarnation, the Word made flesh. As Doran discovered in St. Louis, prior to and apart from his first serious encounter with Lonergan, the emphasis on the act of existence in existential Thomism, which they agree is of St. Thomas, is needed to distinguish two natures in one divine person under the penalty of monophysitism. I could hardly wait to say that word out loud. When we think of the real distinction this way, it takes on an even greater significance with respect to the isomorphism between the discrete levels of cognitional operation on the one hand, catalyzed by the act of understanding, and on the other hand, the elements of metaphysics, in other words, the relation between conjugate and central potency, form, and act is the apex term. Other Thomistic metaphysicians, Gilson and Maritain among them, converge on an existential reading. But this convergence does not allay the naive or direct realist's fear of idealism. It does not settle the questions concerning the starting point of philosophical investigations, what counts as first philosophy, the relation of epistemology to metaphysics, and which one has priority. At issue is the turn to the subject, and at issue in Lonergan's turn is the suspicion that he is a German idealist in Thomistic clothing. We should think of this as a productive suspicion to harbor in working our way to a grasp of Lonergan's critical realism and transcendental method, which Doran follows to the letter in his own work. Following Doran's account of Lonergan's discovery of St. Thomas in 1936, Cummings appears to change the subject by asking him whether there is something he would like to clear up, a neglect or a misunderstanding. The thread we want to follow now appears in clear view. Doran responds that there are two things that concern him, one from the Catholic right, the other from the other side. He judiciously says that there are misconceptions on both sides with respect to divisions within the church. He mentions the theological turmoil of the 70s. From the Catholic right, what concerns Doran is that there are still people who suspect that Lonergan is an idealist, a Kantian. Although we will not do so in this paper, Doran swiftly dismisses this mistaken view. He simply cites Sala and has done with it. And despite the common but variable use of the term transcendental, the confusion of Lonergan's thought with the transcendental Thomism that seeks to reconcile Aquinas and Kant is wide of the mark. Indeed, it can be shown that Lonergan's critique of Kant substantially aligns with Hegel's and is equally decisive. Cleaving Lonergan away from Kant is not enough to cleave him away from idealism, or rather the constructive and even necessary role the startling strangeness plays on the way to the promised land of virtually unconditioned judgment and critical realism, the heuristic anticipations of a universal viewpoint and cosmopolis, the fulfillment of the pure and unrestricted desire to know, general and special transcendent knowledge, and the projection of a world cultural humanity. We will pause here, although Doran does not. He continues to flesh out his answer to Cummings concerning misconceptions from the Catholic Rite. He says, the right would like to get Lonergan, but they can't. They know that he's orthodox, but they are threatened by an ecclesiology that recognizes the church as a historical process of self-constitution that changes by way of the creativity of experience, understanding, judgment, and responsible decision. Later in the interview, Doran also attributes classicism to the right, which is germane to our conference theme of belief, still today's issue. But from the other side, Doran tells Cummings that it is precisely Lonergan's theological orthodoxy that leads him to be very upset, in Doran's words, with the denial inside Catholic theology of the resurrection, the divinity of Christ, and the Trinity. Doran says, I saw this in conversations. His ears must have been burning. My reason to remain with the question concerning the Catholic Rite's fear of idealism is twofold. The first is the canonical reference to idealism as the halfway house between the naive realism that Lonergan and Doran take to be incoherent and the critical realism that Lonergan works out in Insight, which achieves coherence by way of a passage through the halfway house and the startling strangeness that accompanies it. Second, in connection with the intellectualist, dynamic, and existential cast of Lonergan's thought, Lonergan's historical mindedness is foundational. Lonergan assigns the revolutionary 19th century discovery of historical mindedness to Hegel. As Theology and the Dialectics of History is a masterpiece of dialectics, it is also a masterpiece of historical mindedness. The homologies between Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and Doran's Theology and the Dialectics of History are striking. Each book proceeds from a psychology that opens upon the vast horizon of the dramatic spectacle of human history. For Doran, there is the virtually unconditioned judgment and the heuristic anticipation of a universal viewpoint, cosmopolis, and a world cultural humanity. For Hegel, absolute knowing can be paraphrased as history philosophically comprehended, which goes to the conclusion of his great book. These are the reasons to linger on the passage through the halfway house of Hegel's absolute speculative idealism after Kant, which Lonergan and Doran take as their stepping stone in their ascent to the higher viewpoint of critical realism. It would not be surprising if Lonergan's passage into modernity was a passage through Hegelianism. But to avoid confusion, Lonergan has the last word. In chapter 14 of Insight, The Method of Metaphysics, he writes, Hegelian dialectic is conceptualist, closed, necessitarian, and eminental. His subsequent demonstrations right the ship and course correct for critical realism, although there are many ways to read Hegel, a point that I had to smuggle in. To return to the crux of the problem in the duality of human knowing, in the introduction to Insight, Lonergan considers the logical, psychological, and metaphysical implications of this duality. He writes, were there no psychological problem, the first part of Insight could be reduced to sets of definitions and clarifications. For, from a logical viewpoint, the first judgment that occurs in the work is the judgment of self-affirmation in the 11th chapter. The 11th chapter is self-affirmation of the knower. Launching his project in Theology and the Dialectics of History with Bernard Lonergan's notion of the subject, Doran writes the following about chapter 11. It is difficult, probably impossible, to display in a brief summary the power of Lonergan's argument in the 11th chapter of Insight. Yet this and the two chapters that follow it, treating respectively the notion of being and the notion of objectivity, are at the base of everything else that I will say in this book. Lonergan's point is that the problem of the duality of human knowing is not a logical but a psychological problem. He continues, the hard fact is that the psychological problem exists, that there exist in man two diverse kinds of knowing, that they exist without differentiation and in an ambivalent confusion, until they are distinguished explicitly and the implications of the distinction are drawn explicitly. Again, the hard fact of the hard problem is not remediable by mathematical logic. In fact, mathematical logic leads to the impasse between completeness and consistency entailed by Gödel's theorem. Once Lonergan broaches the problem, he tells us that it is his business to herd us across the pons asinorum. He cautions us about the nature of a moving viewpoint. He condenses the movement through 20 chapters into a single paragraph. Then he paraphrases Gödel's theorem in order to go beyond it, not in the direction of greater abstractness, but in the direction of greater concreteness, and not to greater concreteness on the side of the object, but to greater concreteness on the side of the subject. With respect to greater concreteness on the side of the subject, let us linger once again. The caution concerning Lonergan was the dread of modern philosophy and the turn to the subject. This was taken to be a basic philosophical mistake. It would end in idealism. Once you go in, you'll never go out. But Doran explains the problem differently. His point of reference is Alexander Kojèv's interpretation of Hegel, grounded in the notion of consciousness that lies behind the failure of the modern turn to the subject. Consciousness as representation in the quest for the absolute status of certitude or power. Postmodernity replaces consciousness as representation in quest of cognitive certitude with consciousness as representation in quest of interpersonal and historical domination. Doran's judgment on this failure is as follows. With this transposition from certitude to domination, the historicist relativism that resulted from the incompleteness of the modern turn to the subject gives way to a historical activism for which what succeeds is alone true and what fails is alone false. And the atheism that rejected the notion of divine attributes as conceptually inconceivable gives way to the atheism that appropriates these attributes for the human subject. The situation or context of systematic theology is constituted only remotely by the failure of the modern turn to the subject as such, and proximately by the activist nihilism that is the postmodern upshot of that failure. This point cannot fail to be made. The failure does not lie in turning to the subject. It lies in the incompleteness of the modern turn, which runs aground in activist nihilism. Accordingly, it needs to be said that in Lonergan's discovery of the subject as subject in the third kind of presence, it is Lonergan who completes the turn. To solve the psychological problem, Lonergan has to break the impasse of Gödel's theorem. He has to break through the Gödelian limitations he identifies in his metalogical account of mathematical logic in Phenomenology and Logic. After his lengthy discussion, he concludes as to its significance. The human mind, as St. Thomas says, has a natural desire for the beatific vision. It is infinitely open. That openness is something that upsets this effort, the initial naive logical ideal of starting out from a whole set of axioms from which you deduce everything that is to be known. Logicism and conceptualism are cognate notions. There is no solution there. Therefore, next, Lonergan turns from logical to metaphysical considerations when he italicizes the well-known sentence that has the ring of a slogan and that sums up the positive content of this work. Thoroughly understand what it is to understand, and not only will you understand the broad lines of all there is to be understood, but you will also possess a fixed base and invariant pattern, opening upon all further developments of understanding. With the fixed base and invariant pattern in mind, on which everything else depends, in Doran's thought as well as Lonergan's, Lonergan next decisively states the basic solution to the more basic psychological problem of the duality of human knowing in the critical realism that presupposes our passage, which we can think of as indispensable through the basic insight of idealism into the correlation of logic with existence. and the mutuality, reciprocity, and complementarity of the internal relation between subjectivity and truth. Lonergan writes, the appropriation of one's own rational self-consciousness, which has been so stressed in the introduction, is not an end in itself, but rather a beginning. It is a necessary beginning, for unless one breaks the duality in one's knowing, one doubts that understanding correctly is knowing. Under the pressure of that doubt, either one will sink into the bog of a knowing that is without understanding, or else one will cling to understanding but sacrifice knowing on the altar of an immanentism, an idealism, a relativism. From the horns of that dilemma, one escapes only through the discovery, and one has not made it yet if one has no clear memory of its startling strangeness, that there are two quite different realisms, that there is an incoherent realism, half animal and half human, that poses as a halfway house between materialism and idealism, and on the other hand, that there is an intelligent and reasonable realism, between which and materialism, the halfway house is idealism. If self-appropriation is a matter of going in, then going in is not an end in itself. It runs on the power of self-transcendence. It is both inner-directed and outer-directed. You must go out. But going in is the necessary condition for the outward movement of praxis or world-transforming action. Doran's development of this point in his book as a whole, and in the chapters in Part 3 on Cosmopolis and the Dialectic of Community, Infrastructure and Superstructure, Theology, the Church and Liberation, and Theology as Praxis, centers on the achievement of what he names a post-interiority mentality. Incidentally, we can notice that Lonergan's reference to materialism is a gloss on naive realism, and I really enjoyed writing this paragraph, such as we would also find it in Lenin's vulgar copy theory of knowledge in his screed, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. It turns out that in the theory of knowledge, Missouri Valley Thomism virtually coincides excuse me, with the vulgar materialism of Lenin's book. Lenin was attempting to put down the neo-Kantian heresy of Mach and Avenarius, the fear of a German idealist insinuating himself into the lifeblood of Catholic thought could only reinforce the wisdom of the oath against modernism, if only it weren't foredoomed, like Bolshevism, by the modern world itself. The conclusive point to be made here concerning theology and the dialectics of history is that extra-logical steps must be taken from a Lonerganian metalogical point of view in order to evoke an alternative countercultural situation, a new situation, off the grid, that can break the gridlock of the rival imperialisms, both of which, in their will to power, equally portend the nihilistic future of a post-historic humanity. What is required is a transposition from logic to method. To resume our thread then, Lonergan undertakes a turn to the subject in order to work out the method. In Doran's work, the dialectic of the subject is basic to the dialectic of community and the dialectic of culture. The dialectic of the subject is the relation of linked but opposed principles of psyche and spirit or intentionality. When derailments occur and distortions arise, the intellectual and affective integrity of this dialectic is sabotaged and undermined. Hence, the standing need for ongoing and even relentless psychic, intellectual, moral, and religious conversion. This is interior work, but the fear of idealism and naive realism and vulgar materialism signifies the failure to cross the pons asinorum. What is signified in turn by this failure to attain a critical realism is the failure not only of naive realism, but also the sacrifice of knowing on the altar of an immanentism, an idealism, a relativism. This is the situation that leads Doran to argue that the problem is not the turn to the subject, but the incompleteness of this turn in modern modes of thought, which Lonergan himself completes by way of his breakthrough to the subject as subject in the third mode of presence. May I keep going for a minute?
Yeah, go for it.
This far into the paper, since it is to Father Doran's point that we are all seeking direction in the vital movement of life, a direction that can be lost or found, I should map out where we are headed. So when Professor Heaps reached out to me, his invitation came with 2 cue cards. First, Lonergan's essay, Belief, Today's Issue, and second, the excursus on belief from chapter 20 of Insight, the concluding chapter on special transcendent knowledge, with the platform-level view of the task of theology to mediate between religion and culture, even apart from the revealed truths of the Catholic faith. Lonergan goes to the lengths of the excursus because it is necessary to be clear and precise about the indispensable place of belief in the architecture of knowledge, especially with respect to the known unknown. Lonergan originally spoke to Belief, Today's Issue in 1968. In Doran's 2006 interview with Cummings 38 years later, it is striking how he follows the same path to the same conclusion to the letter. So I will pick up the narrative arc from there. On the way to that conclusion, concerning a contemporary variant of the medieval conflict between Augustinians and Aristotelians, Doran also concisely states his theory of a dialectic of culture, which is my nominal topic. A little bit more?
Please. I would say you could take 10 more minutes.
All right. I'm reading like a speed demon, so I can. With respect to the dialectic of culture and the meanings and values that constitute a way of life, I will focus on the nature of the soteriological differentiation. So that's what this paper is really about, and we'll never get to it here, the soteriological differentiation, which Doran proposes as the mediating and integrating term of the post-axial relation between the cosmological and anthropological dimensions of culture. Within this narrower focus, I want to suggest a hypothesis. So I read the safe part of the paper first, hoping that you would stop me.
Sorry about that.
In connection with Doran's development of the notion of soteriological differentiation in the dialectic of culture, I propose to link his use of the verb to force to a philosophical interpretation of the technique of forcing in set theory that comes from Alain Badiou. If my comparison is not implausible, it may cast light on the relation between logic and existence, subjectivity and truth, the relation of general to special categories, the further step from belief to faith, the heuristic anticipation of a universal viewpoint, and the transposition from logic to method. Forcing is the set theoretical technique developed by Paul Cohen as a way out of the impasse of what Lonergan calls the Gödelian limitations that afflict mathematical logic and motivate the transposition. In the introduction to Insight, Lonergan finds the deep source of the problem in the duality of human knowing. As this duality shows up in relation to belief, false starts typically arise from misconstruing Lonergan's distinction between beliefs on the one hand and immanently generated or personally acquired knowledge on the other hand, within the general architecture of knowledge and the collaboration of mankind in its advancement and dissemination. Examples of false starts include Russell's lapse into logical positivism after he discovered that knowledge by direct acquaintance is mute and incorrectly inferred that it is therefore incommunicable, since he had no notion of an inner word, but according to whom most of what we say is false. Or Popper's epistemology without a knowing subject, or the inscrutability of reference and indeterminacy of translation that bedevil Quine's theory of a web of belief, or the once standard account of knowledge in analytic epistemology as justified true belief, giving rise to one Gettier problem after another. False starts such as these illustrate the limits of logicism in philosophical and theological investigations, cognate with deductivism, rationalism, conceptualism, essentialism, and as long as we're throwing everything in but the kitchen sink, and classicism too, as well as mechanical and computational theories of mind, which process information but are devoid of meaning and are not far off from Lonergan's more whimsical, metaphysical sausage machine. The conclusion I will draw is that Gödelian limitations can be surmounted by way of the transposition to method and what Patrick Murray and Jean Schuler call just enough phenomenology, in the manner of Lonergan's heuristic anticipation of a universal viewpoint, the radical fulfillment of the pure and unrestricted desire to know, the achievement of a world cultural humanity, the arrival of Cosmopolis, and an even closer approximation to the reign of God in society and history. Now, I just go on and on, but the only other thing I'd like to tell you before I give myself a cease and desist order is that the paper devolves from prose into notes and so forth. But on pages 2 and 3, 32 and following, I developed a table, which I'd really like to show you. But the only reason I'm mentioning it now is that we've just had this discussion about Plato, which was excellent. And Doran appeals to Plato on some occasions, and in particular, when he gets to the last of, or the middle of these three chapters, let's see, chapter 16 here, on theology and the dialectic of culture, he comes to a section called the partner. And in Plato's case, this is the attempt to ground oneself in a world transcendent source. And I think based on the discussion that we had just now, the notion of partnership has some resonance. So Doran has Plato looking for a partner. In other words, Doran takes the view that philosophy requires a theological foundation. Isn't that interesting? And later on in the paper, I want to pit Doran against Heidegger on this very point, because Heidegger argues in Introduction to Metaphysics that theology is no longer possible, because you need an age of faith. And what I do in this chart then, this is what I wanted to tell you, and then I'll stop, is that if the partner in Plato's case is a world transcendent source, the partner in the case of a Christian, I wanted to call the partner prime, and that would be Christ. And the trick is to understand, at least for me, the trick was to understand why these two principles of culture, a cosmological principle and an anthropological principle, can't just be mediated and integrated under their own steam, or why a third set of terms and relations is required. And that third set of terms and relations is the soteriological differentiation. And I propose that it's not really very easy to understand in Father Doran, but in a way it goes right to the heart of the matter, that we have a partner prime in Christ. And with that little bit of piety, I think I'll stop myself.
Well, we have plenty of time for discussion. Yeah, Tom, I'll let you feel you're on Andrew and then also
Oh, good.
whichever order.
Yeah, Andrew, Patrick?
This was thank you, this is really fascinating. I want the whole thing. I want the whole thing.
I was hoping you'd say that.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, Pat Byrne once made the remark that that Lonergan's cosmology was deeply influenced by Teilhard. Now I haven't seen that documented, but I'm not making it up. Have you heard him say that? I mean, does that ring a bell to you?
Yeah, I mean, insofar he talks about Teilhard.
Yeah. I mean, he makes reference every now and again, but evidently it was more formative than shows up in text. And that last point that you landed on
Yeah.
kind of makes me go,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
very compelling. I'm just curious what your reaction is.
The only, if I look like I balked initially,
Yeah.
it's not quite right. Just as I was a teenage Marxist, I was also a teenage process philosopher.
Oh, okay.
And the way people talk about Teilhard today, he gets appropriated to like Whitehead.
Yeah.
I used to be a Whiteheadian.
Okay.
And Charles Hartshorne.
Sure.
And it's because I didn't want to come around to the category of substance. I don't know why. But the point is that as the notion of soul is really indispensable, we can't do without it.
Right.
So too is the notion of substance indispensable. And I had to be dragged there, kicking and screaming. And then my only further comment would be to say that St. Thomas is not Aristotle. St. Thomas so far transcends anything that Aristotle ever thought of, and we could go into this because a person might be tempted to conclude that the Aristotelian metaphysics concludes in a stasis, like the Parmenidean sphere of a first unmoved mover. And actually, Professor Heap should take over at this point because he makes this point in his book, that Lonergan turns that whole way of thinking inside out, that if we didn't have at least the Thomistic conception of substance, Parmenides would have won, is what Lonergan says in his dissertation. And when I tried to figure out why Parmenides would have won, scales fell from my eyes, and I abandoned process philosophy. But I, Teilhard, I read The Phenomenon of Man when I was a kid, The Divine Milieu, loved that stuff. But as long as we're clear that it's not, that Lonergan's thought is not a process philosophy in the strict sense.
Oh yeah, no.
Then we're good to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Am I answering your
You
question?
are. No, that's very compelling. Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder only because this is sort of on the same line a little bit. You mentioned Kojève, and it was an illuminating way to invoke it. It was Doran talking about it.
Doran talking about Kojève, yeah.
But I wonder if you thought about, Clayton and I were talking about this, facade. I mean, he's the one that seems to loom very high, and I wonder if Doran talks about him, or if you have thoughts. Lonergan cites him, in particular, as reading of Dialectics. And in the background of power and the breakthrough, etc., far more than Kojève, Fassard seems to be the guy.
Yeah. I didn't know who Fassard was until, Andrew, if you don't know, is the editor of this outstanding volume called Philosophy as a Spiritual Exercise. And who is the author that writes about Fassard in that volume?
Her name is, she's Romanian, Italian, Anna is her name. I can't recall her last name.
That was almost my favorite essay in the collection. And I mean, it's a very well-written essay. I never heard of Fassard until I came across that essay.
I can come up with her last name for him.
And it's really good.
She has a book on it. But do you think there's that connection? Would it be more illuminating what Doran is doing, the Fassard dialectic?
I don't know. I don't think I want to answer that question. I wouldn't be opposed to that thought. And we're talking about Lonergan in the 1930s. So, I mean, Kojève and Hippolyte, a French reception of Hegel, a kind of milieu there in this interwar period. And you're the expert on that question. And I just said I never even heard of Fassard until I saw the essay in your volume.
Well, Lonergan cites method in theology.
Okay.
Much later. In the Dialectics.
Oh, did I also say I'm a Johnny-come-lately to Lonergan studies? Please continue.
No, it's okay. I just wondered your thoughts because of the political dimension in particular.
Yeah.
Which is, Fassard has this whole dialectic of the political and cosmological.
Yeah.
Which for Fassard, the political is more or less the anthropological, right? Because the emergence of the...
Yes. Yeah. And Fassard, or rather the author, in this, I would say, brilliant essay, comes very close to turning Fassard into the young Marx,
Yeah.
which would be sweet music to my ears, but it's not everybody's taste. Speaking of taste, we discussed that earlier.
Yeah.
I'm not really, I'm more or less dodging you.
No, that in itself is good. Thank you. I was hoping you gave the whole historical sweep, that you might find that in there.
I know who I'm talking to, so if it was my students, I'd be glad to go into a whole historical sweep.
Excuse me. Your paper mentioned Eric Vogelin, but you were not able to get to it.
Yeah.
And I saw post-historic humanity. That
Yes.
is Louis Montfort.
Yes.
Can you speak to the influence of Louis Montfort and Eric Vogelin in Doran, especially in his dialectics of contraries between cosmological and anthropological, leading to soteriological culture and dialectic of culture?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the poles of the dialectic, limitation and transcendence, with respect to the side of limitation, society could devolve into the satanic reign of general bias. I mean, and then that's what Doran means by a post-historic humanity. And I don't want to make political remarks here necessarily, but we might have a gefühl of post-historic humanity in our present moment concerning this war and the illiteracy of the people guiding this war with respect to history itself. And, you know, we could, so the opposite of a complete collapse into general bias would be cosmopolis, the achievement of a universal viewpoint and cosmopolis. And likewise, Doran arrays a post-historic humanity against a world cultural humanity.
Sure.
And in as much as both for the subject and for history, it's about finding a direction in the vital movement of life, a direction that can be lost or found. There's a teleology here, or there's a finality here, but we're beyond the philosophy of guarantees. So you have two principles of culture, a cosmological and an anthropological. The anthropological principle is post-axial, and is axial age still a thing? It is for Doran, Jaspers and so forth. Yeah. So it's a legit way to speak. So you have the emergence of a post-axial anthropological principle, which Doran, when he first writes about it, needs to transform. So you might recall that he takes the anthropological principle and metamorphoses it into a transformed anthropological principle. And this is really the awakening to subjectivity. I think the basic tension here, if I understand your question correctly, is really, and we don't do this in our universities anymore, it's Athens and Jerusalem. So he regards the Greeks as having broken through into the anthropological principle of culture, and yet, let me put it like this: there's an inability on Greek terms to bring the groceries home. And it really has to do, so what I wanted to do in this paper was talk a little bit about the logical impasse, or Gödelian limitations, and align those side by side. Here's the answer to your question with, the vicious circle of moral impotence. And so we're in a condition of originated original sin. So you want the lion to lie down with the lamb, and you want an integrated and integral culture that would mediate cosmological and anthropological principles. But on account of the vicious circle of moral impotence, the trick can't be pulled off. And so it's early in the text that Doran first goes to the vicious circle. Yeah. Here's transforming the anthropological principle is the first of these chapters. And you already know where this is going, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's the necessity of a partner. So these are brief sections at the end of that middle chapter before world cultural humanity. Section 5 called the partner, a section 6 called the fear of death, and a section 7 called sin and grace. So just as this technique of forcing and set theory is transversal to completeness and consistency, so too is redemption transversal to progress and decline.
Yes.
So it's really, why do we need soteriological differentiation? Well, why do we need redemption? And let us each ask ourselves this question, why do we need to be redeemed in the first place? And it's because not only is there a logical impasse, there is an existential and historical impasse as well, which I think is vividly on display while we're meeting this afternoon, of the vicious circle of moral impotence, which is, and I'm sorry to trip over my tongue so much, but I think,
I mean, I have a follow-up, but it is not for you. You just read, you presented on Theology and Dialectics of History. The follow-up where Doran fleshed out in compressed format Theology and Dialectics of History is what is systematic theology. That's where are the integrations.
yes.
So apart from TDH and what is systematic theology, if you are to teach a text.
Oh, I'm so happy you asked me that. I'll give you an easy answer.
Accompanying contemporary text, because I am asking this to this audience, because I am going to use TDH. I will use what is systematic theology, but I'm looking for another text that would complement and broaden the horizon of what Doran is doing in TDH. So I need help.
Yeah, not for me though. Here's where I can hardly wait to say. I am a philosopher. I am but a humble philosopher.
It's not directed to you.
Yeah, it's directed to the room. Gotcha. Yeah. So I don't know. Somebody else.
Yes.
There's a couple people, Father Joseph, who want to respond to you.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Tom, very much. I've been looking forward to your presentation because of the theme of dialectic of culture, which to me has a little different angle of approach. And that is, it seems that the originality is at least partly that he respects the cosmological pole, whereas the axial age moves from that to the anthropological as if it's all gain and no loss. And so the idea of how does he put it, the rhythms of the human body and physical nature are kind of the normative horizon of consciousness and principle of the organization of society. Well, if you're interested in the Paleolithic, that's good, because it allows you to say, yes, we've moved way past that, inconceivably perhaps even past that, but there are things that can be learned. It is not all lost. And in regard to Laudato Si, in the book that Joseph edited on that, I mean, Laudato Si is needed because of the imbalance or the lack of an integral dialectic between the two poles. So today, and I think Doran is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think his emphasis is on the value of the cosmological and not simply the anthropological.
Yeah, he says that too, I'm sorry. He writes about, I mean, it's 1990 and he's already writing about looming ecological catastrophe. And,
Yeah.
so thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Your presentation is so profound and very prolific. So I was trying to, figure out exactly what I may call, the resume of the position of Doran in relationship with the works of Lonergan. And there was a place where I saw you made a remark. Probably, I think Doran was trying to avoid what I think you described, or Lonergan tried to avoid what you described as avoiding the Gettiers problems. So my question, I was trying to figure out whether in the interpretations of Lonergan by Doran, was he actually trying to correct what he could consider problems in the writings or the writings of Lonergan, or was he trying to provide justification for what he thinks are limits of his writings?
He is so if I'm understanding your question, and then I guess somebody addressed the room, my switch switched off. I got lost in Minneapolis. I'm here in body alone. The business about psychic conversion.
Yeah.
And so we all know, it's a lovely story about how they were living in the same community at Regis. I think they were just passing each other, Doran and Lonergan. Doran had been here and he gets assigned to Regis. Lonergan had been at Regis and he's on his way to Boston College. So they're living together in the same Jesuit community. And Doran's been thinking about this business of psychic conversion. And he writes something like 25 theses. And then he asks Father Lonergan, he asks him 2 questions. Do I understand you correctly? And is this a worthwhile project? And he sees Lonergan playing solitaire. I'm going to tell this story. He sees Lonergan playing solitaire in the rec room. And he goes up and hands him the theses together with his 2 questions. And then about a half hour later, there's a knock on Doran's door. It's Father Lonergan. And he's already typed something out in answer to the 2 questions. He's typed, yes, you understand me correctly, and yes, I think this is a project worth pursuing. So he writes that first book about psychic conversion, and I guess there's his reputation in a way. And then, of course, the notion of psychic conversion is integrated into TDH. And I believe if I had the time, I could find a note where he says that he and Lonergan don't, this is the one way in which he departs from Father Lonergan. And it's very modest and understated. Am I responding to what you're asking?
Yeah, you're responding to me because I understand very well, because in Doran's work, there was where he was talking about there could be contraries that are not contradictories. Dialectics of contraries and dialectics of contradictories, of which I don't think he's at contradiction with Lonergan. I think maybe it's more of being contrary to his opinion. But then my question was that solving what he thinks is a problem in Lonergan, or justifying or enlightening more what I think he could think could be a limitation in the interpretations of Lonergan? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think what is going on in there is Doran is explaining dialectics. That dialectics is not just of contradictories, and that is the first part of your paper. Okay.
Yeah.
So that in the first part of your paper you gave examples of dialectics of contraries and dialectics of contradictions.
Yes.
So if I understand your question, it is not departing from Lonergan. It is rather responding to a one-sided interpretation of dialectics that is much more Hegelian, that is more focused on contradictories.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, other people can weigh
Sure.
in. This is my
It
understanding.
makes more sense, yeah.
Well, the two contradictions are truth and falsehood and good and evil. And this is why he makes, I think he has a very poor reception of Marx in this book through no fault of his own. And I'm pretty confident he could have done better. And then you wonder about like his other primary sources, like Eric Vogler and Emil Vogler and so on. But and especially though Jung, and I like depth psychology. I studied Freud, but it's above my pay grade. But he's very careful to criticize a kind of prevailing reception of Jung, the shadow side and the need to integrate dark and light, or however you want to put it. And then he draws a pretty bright red line saying this kind of use of Jungian depth psychology is based on the dialectic of contradictories of two terms that can't be reconciled. Good and evil cannot be reconciled. There's no third term that can bring them together. I suppose we already knew that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
That's
that's
the
what
context.
I'm
Yes, yes.
a possible relationship to contradictories and then compossible relationship to contraries. I think that's the term Doran used there.
Our people, I mean, the square of opposition is really quite profound in Aristotle. And I don't think it's taught, in your day it must have been, taught on the first day of class.
Don't ask me to.
Oh. So it doesn't seem like, and then that really clarifies, the square of opposition clarifies the relationship between terms that are opposed that are contrary and terms that are opposed that are contradictory. And again, use that word transversal again with respect to the square.
Can I interject another? I want to help your thoughts. These are talking about the logical and psychological, and the metaphysical. In particular, of course, you might see where I'm leading. You had a line of sort of the historical stuff is interesting because it sets up Father Lonergan and Father Doran's project, in particular in a historical context, which is important philosophically here. And you're talking about the Missouri Valley Thomists and Neo-Scholastics, and you sort of have one little line about the Transcendental Thomists, and I can't resist.
No, you couldn't resist, right? Yes, yeah.
I won't resist.
Yes.
Because I know the historical story, and it's a matter of fact as you sort of report it, but it just seems woefully inadequate to what's actually the Transcendental Thomists wrote. And I understand that as a matter of, so I had the good, I was blessed with the good fortune of being in Leuven when I was younger, and some of these guys were still alive. They were 90 and 100, but students of Marshall and Scheuer.
Yeah.
And in fact, Beau Blanchette was a sort of student of Scheuer. He was a sort of younger generation, but he was really an acolyte of Andre Hayek, who left the society in the 70s when Beau did. John actually had classes with Beau. I only had dinner with him a few times. But anyway, all these guys would say, including Blanchette, these old Belgians, would say, well, the thing is, all of us were teaching metaphysics, special and general metaphysics at the time, and cosmology. Marshall was a psychologist who was asked to teach general metaphysics and natural theology. There's a fundamental difference there, that we all said, well, the psychology is done, right? You have Cahier 5, and now we're going to do the metaphysics. And everyone took that to mean we're just metaphysicians, including Lonergan, which is wildly unfair, right? And this idea that all this whole tradition of transcendental Thomists, including Kareth, by the way, who is no metaphysics, like he writes a book of metaphysics, but it's really cognitional analysis, right? It's the question, and then the heuristic, and then the metaphysics, and then cosmology. And Lonergan says, well, it's a basic and total science. It's a sensitive critique. I understand it, but Kareth's reply is sort of, well, no, you missed the hermeneutic part. Lonergan just never replied.
Mm.
And I just wondered if you sort of see this trajectory as kind of unfair in the whole story, of, especially with the transversal logic and psychology.
I think running parallel to that is Lonergan's dismissiveness of Chavara as well. I think Lonergan just didn't see what Chavara was doing.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
just as an anecdote, you know, I don't know if this letter's published, but there's a letter that Lonergan writes, and he says, Chavara, if that's what he's even called, no one understands what he's saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
He like is pretty. I just don't think Lonergan got it.
Well, I don't think anyone, I mean, I've read Chavara too, and I sympathize. I'm nowhere near, I'm not Lonergan, right? Yeah, no, that's right. But what do you think? Is this, in terms of the transversal, would that correct? Not historically, I'm not asking you to sort of
Right.
do that reading, but if there is a psychology there that grounds critically the logic,
Yes.
would that correct that issue? Begin to, or would it be a possibility?
With respect to a transcendental Thomism, or?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. You know, lots of people think Lonergan is a transcendental Thomist. And I'll just say again, when I was a child, Bill Ryan taught me insight. He said, Korth and Marischal are transcendental Thomists. Lonergan's not a transcendental Thomist.
But you know what Lonergan says in that essay, Horizon, Metaphysics as Horizon, is, I'm happy to be included with the Marshallian movement.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think?
Nolo contendere.
Okay.
But I think you can add to that too, though, Lonergan's relationship to Rousseau, right? Which is something that I thought about a little bit too when you were talking about Lonergan distinguishing his position as an intellectualist one, and that footnote in Verbum when he says, I think maybe not giving quite enough credit that like my position here is anticipated by Rousseau. Like, you know, Rousseau has to be in that story too, about the sort of integration of the psychological.
Yeah, but we know that he also read Marshall, and he doesn't quote Marshall until the introduction to Insight.
Yeah.
He doesn't even quote him, he just says, oh, he did this.
For me, the issue is Lonergan's relation to Kant. I mean, as a systematic issue. And again, I mean, Bill Ryan's dead, so it's easy for me to blame him. Lonergan's not a Kantian. I mean, and in fact, he's decisively not a Kantian. And that's so what I wanted to say in my paper was that cleaving Lonergan away from Kant, with the tropical reference to Sala, that's kind of the standard move, right?
Yes.
Just say Sala and go about your business. But it's not enough to dispel the place of idealism in Lonergan's thought. And so I just want to go to Hegel. And in that questionnaire on philosophy from 1977, Lonergan says, look, there were two revolutions. There was the 17th century revolution, and that was pretty important. But there was an even more important 19th century revolution with the discovery of historical mindedness. And if I had to lean on somebody, it'd be Mark Morelli. But that's the great contribution of Hegel.
You know, just as an anecdote, you know one of the main organizers of that questionnaire? Emmerich Correct. In other words, they have the same issues, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah.
in that essay, Lonergan says explicitly that Carruth's broken from Wolffianism and Kantianism.
Yeah.
Right, so I mean, the reason why it's interesting is I think is that sort of transversal move you make.
Yeah.
If you can recover logic out of a sort of conceptualism, and isn't that the whole psychological problem?
Okay, I'll just answer yes.
Okay. Sorry, I don't mean to press it. I'm just, you laid it out there. Well, you know, thank you.
I'm going to plead my nightmare in Minneapolis, by the way.
This is super helpful, so thank you so much.
We have time for maybe one more if anybody has something burning. All right, Tom, thank you so much. So grateful for you.
John.
This is my son, the father, the